She was 7 years old, barefoot on a marble floor, and she had just said the 6 words that were about to destroy every lie two people had spent a decade building. The room went quiet the way rooms do when something irreversible happens. Not all at once, but in a slow wave, conversations dropping off one by one until the only sound left was the distant clink of champagne glasses from people who hadn't yet realized the world had just shifted on its axis. Cole Harrington stood with a wrench still in his hand and grease on his knuckles, staring down at a little girl who was staring up at him like she already knew something he didn't. And across the marble floor, 30 feet away, one of the most powerful women in the country had gone completely still, because she recognized what this moment was. She had been afraid of it for 7 years. She had built an empire partly to make sure it never happened. It was happening anyway. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Cole had been at the Whitmore estate since 6 in the morning. The Sterling Foundation's annual charity gala didn't start until 4 in the afternoon, but the estate's backup generator had developed a fault 3 days earlier, and the event coordinator, a sharp-voiced woman named Patricia, who communicated entirely in clipped sentences, had made it clear that having no power during a 500-person event, attended by senators, CEOs, and at least 2 former cabinet members, was not an option she was prepared to consider. So Cole came early. He drove his truck through the service entrance, parked beside a catering van, and spent the first 2 hours in the basement with a flashlight between his teeth, tracing electrical faults through a generator system that was older than it had any right to be for a property worth what this one was worth. He was used to that. Rich people spent money on the things guests could see. The machinery underneath was always held together with neglect and luck. By 11, he had the generator running cleanly. By noon, he was in the East Garden checking the outdoor lighting rigs the events team had installed wrong. By 2 o'clock, he was sitting on an overturned equipment crate eating a sandwich he'd packed from home and watching the chaos of a high-end charity event assembling itself around him with the same detached calm he applied to most things. Cole was good at being invisible. He'd spent years training for it, in a different context, and some skills don't leave you just because the mission does. He was 47. No, 37, though people who met him sometimes guessed older, not because he looked worn down, but because he had a stillness about him that most men his age hadn't yet developed. The kind of stillness that comes from having been in situations where panic is the thing that gets you killed. He had the hands of someone who worked with them constantly, scarred across the knuckles, the skin slightly thickened at the palm from years of tools and ropes and surfaces that weren't designed to be gentle. There was a tattoo on his left wrist, a phoenix mid-flight, the lines clean and deliberate. He'd had it for 11 years. He didn't talk about what it meant. His daughter Mia was at school. She got out at 3:15 and his neighbor Janet had already agreed to pick her up if he wasn't back in time. Mia was 7, missing her 2 front teeth, and currently obsessed with building elaborate structures out of cardboard boxes and packing tape that she insisted were architectural masterpieces. Cole had 3 of them on display in the living room because he didn't have the heart to throw them out. His ex-wife, who had never actually been his wife, they'd been together briefly, 2 lost people who made a child together and then slowly, without cruelty, figured out they were better apart, had primary custody in another state. But Mia had been with Cole for 6 months while her mother dealt with a family situation, and those 6 months had rearranged something permanent in Cole's chest. He was a mechanic. He ran a small shop with 2 employees, took on fleet contracts from 3 local businesses, did private work on weekends. It was not a glamorous life. It was a life he had built deliberately, with both hands, after leaving the Navy SEALs at 32 with 2 commendations, a bad shoulder that still ached in cold weather, and a deep, settled exhaustion with violence of any kind. He had wanted quiet. He had wanted something that stayed put. He had wanted to fix things that could actually be fixed. The gala came together around him. Florists arranged centerpieces on tables draped in white linen. A string quartet did a sound check in the main hall. Security personnel in dark suits walked the perimeter with the particular blank expression of people being paid to look intimidating. Cole watched them with the mild interest of someone who had once done things those men couldn't imagine and felt no need to prove it. He was packing up his tools at 3:15 when the convoy arrived. Three black SUVs pulled through the main gate in close formation, the kind of arrival that other guests stopped to notice. Cole didn't stop, but he looked, because you always look. That was just habit. And he watched the middle vehicle's door open and a woman step out who carried herself like someone who had learned, through long practice, to take up exactly the amount of space a room could handle. She was younger than he would have guessed for the name he'd heard the estate staff mention several times that morning. Adeline Sterling, 30 years old, CEO of Sterling Consolidated, which was, according to Patricia, the event coordinator, who had offered this information with a reverence that suggested she expected Cole to be more impressed than he was. One of the largest privately held investment firms in the country. She had inherited the company at 22 after her father's heart attack and spent 8 years turning it from a corporation on the edge of scandal into something genuinely formidable. Business magazines called her ruthless. People who'd worked with her called her precise. Cole had no opinion. He didn't follow business news. What he saw was a woman in a dark green dress who was scanning the estate grounds with the same automatic situational awareness he recognized from people who'd been in dangerous environments. Not looking at anything specific, but making sure nothing was wrong. She spotted the security positions without appearing to. She clocked the exits. She did all of it while smiling at the estate director who was walking out to greet her. Behind her, a bodyguard stepped out of the vehicle. And then, before the bodyguard had fully straightened up, a small figure bolted past his legs and took off running across the garden. Cole saw the child before anyone else moved. She was maybe 6 or 7, in a yellow dress with her dark hair in 2 braids that had started to come loose, and she was running the way small children run when they've been sitting still for too long. With complete commitment, arms pumping, no particular destination in mind. The bodyguard lunged, missed, and then started running after her with the constrained urgency of a large man who can't fully sprint without looking absurd. The little girl ran straight toward Cole. He set down the tool bag. He crouched slightly, not blocking her path, just making himself less large, and when she reached him, she stopped so abruptly she nearly tipped forward. He steadied her with one hand on her shoulder without thinking about it. She was breathing hard from the run, cheeks pink, and she was grinning the way kids grin when they've done something they know they shouldn't have. Then she looked down at his hand on her shoulder, and her grin changed into something else. She looked at his wrist. She looked at the tattoo. She looked back up at him, and the grin was gone entirely, replaced by an expression of total seriousness that seemed too large for her small face. "You have the same tattoo as my mom," she said. Cole didn't move. The bodyguard arrived, slightly out of breath, and put a hand on the girl's other shoulder. "Miss Sophie, you can't just—" "He has the same tattoo," Sophie said again, as if the bodyguard hadn't spoken. She hadn't taken her eyes off Cole's wrist. Cole looked down at the phoenix on his left wrist. He had looked at it so many times over 11 years that he'd stopped seeing it the way other people might. It was just part of him. But he heard the words, and something moved through him that he couldn't immediately identify. A cold kind of stillness, the feeling that arrives just before something important happens. He looked up. Adeline Sterling was crossing the garden toward them, and her face had changed completely. The composed expression she'd worn when she stepped out of the SUV was gone. She walked quickly, not quite running, with her eyes fixed on her daughter, and then her eyes moved to Cole, and then to his wrist, and she stopped walking. She stopped like someone had cut the power. Cole stood up to his full height. He was 6'1", built solidly, and he stood with the particular uprightness of someone who'd spent years moving through the world, paying attention to it. He looked at Adeline Sterling. She looked at him. He watched her recognize him. He watched her realize he was recognizing her. The estate director hovered uncertainly nearby. The bodyguard had his hand on Sophie's shoulder. 2 of the security team had drifted closer, reading the energy of the moment without yet understanding it. Somewhere behind Cole, a florist was unwrapping roses. The whole world seemed to be waiting for one of them to speak. It was Sophie who did it, looking up at her mother with the complete confidence of a child who doesn't yet know that some questions are grenades. "Mama," she said, "his tattoo looks exactly like yours. The bird one. The one you never let me touch." Adeline's mouth opened slightly. She had spent a decade becoming one of the most controlled people in any room she entered. Cole had seen the profile of her in a magazine someone left in the waiting room of his shop. Not read it, just glanced at it. The headline had said something about how she never let anyone see her rattled. that she'd walked into a boardroom full of men who wanted to take her company and walked out having taken 3 of theirs instead. That the people who worked for her described her as someone who always knew the next 4 moves before anyone else knew the game had started. She did not look like that person right now. She looked like a woman who had just watched something she'd been running from for a long time turn around and face her. "Sophie," she said carefully, "go with Marcus for a minute." "But Mama..." "Sophie." Her voice was quiet, but it had a quality that apparently worked on 7-year-olds because Sophie went, though reluctantly, the bodyguard, Marcus, steering her toward the far end of the garden with a practiced steadiness. Adeline didn't move. Cole didn't move. The estate director cleared his throat. "Ms. Sterling, if you'd like to..." "Give us a moment," Adeline said, without looking at him. Her voice was entirely calm. Her hands, Cole noticed, were not entirely calm. Her left hand had closed into a loose fist at her side. The estate director retreated. The nearby security team found things to look at elsewhere, because people with that much professional experience knew when to give space. Cole and Adeline Sterling stood 12 feet apart in a garden where a charity event was assembling itself in every direction, and looked at each other across 10 years. She was different. She'd been 20 when he'd known her, 20 years old and already terrifyingly focused, a young woman trying to hold together a startup that was bleeding money while her father's health deteriorated and the sharks were circling. She'd had the same dark hair, though she wore it differently now. The same quality of attention, the way she made eye contact like she was actually reading information, not just performing eye contact. She was thinner now in the way people get when they carry stress long term. There were lines near her eyes that hadn't been there before. She looked like someone who had worked very, very hard for a very long time and wasn't sure it had been worth it. He probably looked like someone else entirely to her. He'd been 27 when they met. He'd had longer hair then, before the last deployment. He'd carried himself differently, not worse, just differently, with the particular confidence of someone who still had things to prove to himself. He wasn't sure what he had now instead, but it wasn't that. "Cole?" she said. Not a greeting, just the word. His name in her mouth after 10 years felt strange, the way any sound does when it belongs to a context that no longer exists. "Adeline," he said. She glanced at his wrist. He saw her jaw tighten. "How long have you been here?" she said. "At this estate, working this event." "Since 6 this morning." Something moved across her face. Calculation, or maybe something less controlled than that. "I didn't know you were..." She stopped. "I didn't know you were in this area?" "Been here 3 years," he said. She absorbed that. "Your daughter," Cole said, because he had to, because the alternative was standing here trading geography while the thing that actually needed to be said gathered weight between them. "The tattoo," she mentioned. "It's nothing," Adeline said, quickly, too quickly. Cole looked at her steadily. He was good at waiting. He'd spent long portions of his adult life learning how to be still and let things develop, and that skill applied here just as much as it had in places he didn't think about anymore. "It's not nothing," he said. Adeline looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was doing something complicated, not breaking down, not shutting off, but suspended somewhere between the two, the face of someone making a calculation that involves variables she hadn't prepared for. She looked at his wrist one more time. The phoenix. Mid-flight. Clean lines. The same symbol she had described to a tattoo artist in a small shop in San Diego 10.5 years ago, the night before Cole shipped out for the last time, both of them knowing without discussing it that something was ending. She had gotten hers on her left shoulder blade. He knew that because he had been there. She had never expected anyone outside of that room to know what it meant. She had spent 10 years making sure of it. Now a 7-year-old with dark braids and an inability to stay where people put her had walked across a garden and dismantled a decade of careful silence in approximately 8 seconds. "We need to talk," Adeline said. "We do," Cole agreed. She nodded once, the tight, precise nod of someone reorganizing. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick message without looking down at the screen. The fluency of someone who does that constantly. "There's a private room inside the East Wing," she said. "Staff won't be in there until the event starts." "All right." She turned to walk. He fell into step beside her, not quite next to her, the distance of 2 people who are in the same situation without being on the same side of it yet. Across the garden, Marcus was crouched down talking to Sophie, who was watching her mother and the mechanic walk inside together with an expression of absolute, unblinking interest. The child who had started all of this tucked her hands under her legs on the garden bench and waited, with the patience of someone who somehow already knew that the next part of this story was going to take a while. The East Wing sitting room was small by the estate's standards: a settee, 2 armchairs, a writing desk that probably cost more than Cole's truck, and tall windows overlooking a side garden where nobody was working. Adeline shut the door behind them and didn't sit down. Cole didn't either. The room felt too small suddenly, though it was probably 400 square feet, because the two of them were carrying something that needed more space than any room could reasonably offer. Adeline stood near the window with her arms crossed. Not defensively, he thought, more like she was holding herself together through physical pressure. She was looking at a point somewhere past his left shoulder. "I don't know where to start," she said. "Start wherever you need to," Cole said. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him then, directly, and he saw something in her expression that he hadn't seen in the composed woman who had stepped out of that SUV 40 minutes ago. Something tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from not sleeping enough. "How much do you remember?" she asked. "About us. About that time." Cole considered the question. He could have said everything, because that would have been accurate, but it wasn't the right answer for this moment, and he knew it. "Enough," he said. "I remember enough." She nodded slowly and moved away from the window, pacing 2 steps in one direction and then stopping herself. She was someone who didn't pace. He could see her correcting for it. "We were together for 4 months, she said, not like she was reminding him, more like she was establishing agreed facts before moving into contested territory. "You were assigned to a protective detail during the Mercer Industries incident. My father had received threats after the board dispute went public." "I remember." "You were supposed to be there for 3 weeks." "I stayed for 4 months, Cole said, "because I wanted to." Something in her face shifted. "Yes," she said. "Because you wanted to." She said it quietly, like she was reading something written a long time ago. "You left for the deployment in October, the Omen operation." She looked at him steadily. "You told me you'd be back in 90 days. "I meant it. I know you meant it." Her voice didn't have accusation in it, which somehow made it worse. "But you didn't come back in 90 days. "No," Cole said. "I didn't." He'd been injured on the 41st day. An operation in the Yemeni interior that went wrong in the specific cascading way that operations go wrong when intelligence is incomplete and conditions change faster than planning accounts for. He'd taken shrapnel in his right side, and a bad landing had done something to his shoulder that required 3 surgeries to partially correct. He'd spent 6 weeks in a military hospital in Germany, then 4 months in recovery stateside, in a facility with restricted communication protocols because 2 members of his team were still active in the field, and information security was not a suggestion. By the time he could make unrestricted calls, he had called the number he had for Adeline 4 times. All 4 went to a voicemail that was eventually disconnected. He'd written 2 letters to the address he knew for her, which was her father's house in Connecticut. One came back marked "Return to Sender." The other didn't come back at all, so he never knew whether it arrived or simply vanished into the complicated wreckage of whatever had happened to her life while he was unreachable. He had eventually stopped trying. Not because he stopped caring, but because there is a point at which a man runs out of ways to reach someone who seems to have made themselves unreachable, and continuing feels less like persistence and more like something that doesn't have a polite name. He told her the abbreviated version of this now, standing in the estate's East Wing sitting room while caterers unloaded crates somewhere on the other side of the building. He told it plainly, without drama, because that was how he talked about things that mattered. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I found out I was pregnant in November," she said. 6 weeks after you shipped out." The room was very still. Cole heard the string quartet doing another sound check somewhere distant. He heard his own breathing. He felt the information arrive and move through him the way significant things do. Not like a blow exactly, more like a pressure change, the way the air shifts before weather. "November," he said. "I tried to reach you." She said it quickly, not like an excuse, more like something she needed him to know and needed to get out before she lost the ability to say it. "I called your unit. I was told you were unavailable. I called again 2 weeks later and was told the same thing. I didn't have clearance for any more information than that. I didn't know if unavailable meant injured or deployed deeper or... She stopped. Her jaw moved slightly. I didn't know if it meant you were alive. Cole said nothing. There was nothing to say to that wouldn't be inadequate. My father died in December, she continued. The company was technically insolvent. There were 3 board members who had been waiting for exactly that situation to make their move. I had 60 days to either prove I could run Sterling Consolidated or watch my father's life's work get carved up by men who had been trying to take it from him for years. She paused. I was 11 weeks pregnant, and I was in the most significant professional crisis of my life, and the one person She stopped again, started differently. You were gone. I didn't know if you were coming back. I came back, Cole said. 8 months later, she said. Not with bitterness. Just with the precision of someone who had spent time with those facts. Sophie was 2 months old. The number landed. Cole sat down in one of the armchairs because his legs had made a quiet decision to need support. He pressed his hands together between his knees and looked at the floor for a moment and then back up at Adeline, who was still standing, watching him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Part dread, part something that might have been relief, which was strange given the circumstances. She's mine, he said. It wasn't really a question. The tattoo had already answered it, and beyond the tattoo there was the child's face, which he hadn't had long to study, but which had left an impression he was only now processing fully. The shape of her eyes, the way she held absolutely still when she was paying attention to something. He knew that quality from the inside. Yes, Adeline said. He took a breath. Let it out slowly. Why didn't you... He stopped himself because the question was going to come out as an accusation, and he didn't have enough information yet to be sure it was warranted. He tried again. After Sophie was born. After I got back. Why didn't you... I looked for you, Adeline said. After she was born, when I had enough sleep and enough of my mind back to look for you properly. I found out you'd been medically separated from the Seals. I found an address in Virginia. She looked at him carefully. There was a woman there, and a baby. Cole went very still. Rebecca, he said. And Mia. I didn't know who they were. I saw you through a window. You were holding the baby. Something moved across her face that she didn't try to hide or manage. You looked settled, like you'd made a life. Becca and I were never... He pressed his mouth together. It wasn't what it looked like. We were together for about 4 months. She got pregnant. We tried to make it work and couldn't. Mia's been mine from the beginning, but Becca and I were done before Mia was 6 months old. I didn't know that. No, he said. You didn't. The silence that followed had weight to it. Not hostile weight, but the weight of 2 people standing in the wreckage of a series of misunderstandings that had each been reasonable in isolation and catastrophic in accumulation. Cole thought about the specific cruelty of timing, of how many different ways things had managed to go wrong without anyone actually intending harm. I should have tried harder to reach you, Adeline said. She didn't dress it up or qualify it. After Sophie was born, I should have found a way to contact you directly instead of deciding I knew what I saw. You were holding a company together with your bare hands and raising an infant alone, Cole said. I'm not going to sit here and tell you what you should have done. She looked at him like she wasn't sure what to do with that. I'm not letting you off the hook, he added. I just need to understand it before I know what to do with it. She nodded once. She seemed to appreciate the honesty of that more than she would have appreciated something gentler. Cole stood up again. He moved to the window and looked out at the side garden. A formal arrangement of boxwood hedges and late-season flowers that someone tended with obsessive precision. Beyond the hedges, he could see one edge of the main garden where Sophie was presumably still sitting with Marcus, that child with her dark braids, and her complete inability to keep a secret she didn't even know she was keeping. She doesn't know, he said. No, she knows her father wasn't in our lives. She knows I raised her alone. She's never asked for details, and I've been grateful for that. Her voice didn't quite stay steady on the last part. She's smart enough that eventually she'll start asking. How did she know about the tattoo? Adeline came to stand beside him at the window, not close, maintaining the careful distance they'd held across the whole conversation. I have a photo, she said, from that time. We're both in it. You can see your wrist. She found it when she was about 4 and I told her it was an old friend. She paused. She apparently remembered. Cole thought about a 4-year-old committing the detail of a tattoo to memory for 3 years and then acting on it the moment it appeared in front of her. He thought about what that particular quality of attention might indicate about who she was. He thought about the way she had looked up at him in the garden, that complete, unguarded directness. She looks like you, he said. But she pays attention to things the way… He stopped. The way you do, Adeline said quietly. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Outside in the main garden, a door opened and Marcus appeared with Sophie at his side. The child was walking now instead of running, which suggested Marcus had talked her into a more manageable energy level, but she was scanning the estate with both hands shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, and Cole knew without question she was looking for her mother. Or for him. She came right to me, Cole said. In the garden. She wasn't running toward anything. She just ran and she ended up… I know, Adeline said. The 2 words carried a weight he felt rather than heard. He turned from the window. Adeline turned at the same moment and they were briefly much closer than they'd been since the conversation started, close enough that he could see that she hadn't slept well recently. That the composure she wore was a practiced thing, and underneath it was a woman who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. She took a step back. He did the same, the mutual instinct of 2 people who weren't there yet and knew it. There's something else, she said. He waited. She crossed to the writing desk, picked up her phone, and held it without looking at it. 3 months ago, Sophie's pediatrician referred us to a specialist. She'd been having episodes, fatigue, occasional arrhythmia. Nothing severe, but enough to warrant investigation. She set the phone back down. They ran a full panel. They found a marker for a hereditary cardiomyopathy. Low grade, manageable, but the treatment protocol depends on family medical history. She looked at him steadily. Her maternal side is fully documented, but without the paternal history, they can't complete the picture, Cole said. They have a partial treatment plan. Dr. Reyes, the cardiologist, says it's likely sufficient. But with full genetic history on both sides, she could refine it significantly. Reduce Sophie's medication load over time. Improve the long-term outlook. She was using clinical language because clinical language was controllable. He understood that. It's not an emergency. Sophie is healthy and she's being monitored. But it matters. Cole looked at his hands for a moment. The grease that he'd mostly cleaned off, the scar across his right knuckle, the tattoo that had started all of this. I'll do whatever blood work or testing they need, he said. Tell me who to call. Adeline blinked. Just once, just briefly, but it was the kind of blink that happens when something you were braced for doesn't hit you the way you expected. You don't want time to think about it? My daughter needs her medical history completed, Cole said. What's there to think about? She stared at him. I'm not saying that's the end of it, he said, because it isn't. There's a lot I don't know yet, and a lot that's going to need to be figured out, and some of it is going to be complicated, and some of it is going to be uncomfortable, and I don't have any of those answers right now. He kept his voice even, not cold, just honest. But whatever else happens between us, my daughter's health isn't something that waits for me to process my feelings. Adeline pressed her lips together and looked away for a moment, at the window, at nothing. When she looked back at him, he saw something in her face that she probably hadn't meant to let through. I didn't know, she said, how you were going to be about this. Neither did I, Cole admitted. Give me a few hours and I'll probably have feelings about it. Right now I'm just… He paused, finding the word. Operating. She almost smiled. It didn't quite reach her eyes, but it was real. And he recognized the shape of it from a long time ago when they had sat in her father's kitchen at midnight eating crackers and cold cheese, because neither of them had remembered to eat dinner, and she had laughed at something he said, and it had been the realest thing he'd seen in months. A knock at the door. Marcus's voice, quiet and professional through the wood. Ms. Sterling, 20 minutes to the opening reception. Adeline straightened. He watched the CEO reassemble itself over the woman who had been standing in this room having the hardest conversation of the decade. It was a practiced transition, nearly seamless. Nearly. I have to… she started. Go, Cole said. We'll talk more. When? You tell me. You're the one with the schedule." She pulled out her phone, typed something, and his pocket buzzed. He looked down at it, a number he didn't have saved but would not be forgetting. "That's my direct line," she said. "Not my assistant, not the office. That one comes to me." "All right." She moved toward the door and then stopped with her hand on the handle, her back to him. She stayed like that for a moment, not dramatically, not performing anything, just a person pausing before they have to go back out into the world and be who everyone expects them to be. "I'm sorry, Cole," she said. It was quiet. It was not the comprehensive apology that the situation probably eventually warranted, but it was real, and she said it like someone who had been practicing saying it to a version of him in her head for a long time and was relieved to finally say it to the actual one. "I know," he said. She left. Cole stood in the East Wing sitting room for a while after the door closed. He stood at the window and watched the charity gala complete its assembly in the gardens below. The guests arriving, the security team adjusting positions, the string quartet finally playing something continuous instead of fragments. He watched Adeline emerge from the building's main entrance and move through the gathering crowd with the easy command of someone who had spent years learning to be the most important person in any room. He watched Sophie reattach herself to her mother's side and take her hand. He watched Adeline look down at her daughter with an expression that was different from every other expression she'd worn that afternoon. Open and unguarded and complicated, the face of someone looking at something they love so much it frightens them. He watched Sophie look back up at the building and directly at the window where Cole was standing, as if she had known exactly where he was. He stepped back from the window. He picked up his tool bag from where he'd set it down near the door. He walked through the service corridor and out through the east entrance into the employee parking area, where his truck sat beside the catering van, exactly where he'd left it that morning when all of this had still been just a job. He sat in the driver's seat for a while without starting the engine. He pulled out his phone and looked at Adeline's number. Then he called Janet and asked if she could keep Mia a little longer tonight. Janet said, of course. Was everything all right? Cole said yes, he just had something to work through. Janet, who had known him for 2 years and understood that his version of something to work through was about equivalent to anyone else's version of a full crisis, said she'd feed Mia dinner and not to rush. He thanked her and ended the call. He sat in his truck in the parking lot of the Whitmore estate while the charity gala ran its course inside, and he thought about a little girl in a yellow dress with braids coming loose, and the way she had grabbed his hand like it was a natural thing to do, and the words she had said before she had any idea what those words would cost or solve or change. He thought about a phoenix tattoo and what it had meant to get it, and the person he had gotten it with, and the 10 years between then and now. He thought about Sophie needing her father's medical history. He thought about that practical, concrete, undeniable fact, the kind of fact that strips away everything complicated and leaves only what actually matters. He started the truck. He had a lot to figure out. He knew that. He wasn't naive about how hard the next weeks and months were going to be, the negotiations and the history and the grief embedded in all of it, the adjustments that would be required from everyone, including a 7-year-old who didn't yet know why a mechanic with a phoenix tattoo had shown up at the edge of her world and wasn't leaving. But he had been in harder situations than this. He had been in situations with no good options, where the only thing to do was pick a direction and move and keep moving and trust that forward was better than still. He had a daughter. She was 7 years old and she had her mother's composure and his particular way of paying attention to the world. And she had run across a garden on instinct and grabbed the hand of a stranger who turned out not to be a stranger at all. Cole Harrington pulled out of the Whitmore Estates service entrance, turned onto the main road, and drove toward home in the slanted light of a late afternoon that had started as an ordinary workday and ended as something he didn't have a word for yet. He'd find one eventually. He usually did. Cole called the number 3 days later, not because he hadn't thought about calling sooner. He'd thought about it constantly. While changing brake pads on a fleet van Tuesday morning, while making Mia's lunch, while lying on his back in the dark at 2 a.m., staring at a water stain on his bedroom ceiling that he kept meaning to fix. He thought about Sophie's face in the garden. He thought about Adeline's hands, the loose fist at her side, the careful stillness. He thought about the word arrhythmia and what it meant for a 7-year-old's heart, and what it meant that he was the person standing between incomplete information and a better answer. He waited 3 days because he needed to be sure he was calling from a settled place rather than a reactive one. He had learned a long time ago that the decisions you make in the first 48 hours after something significant are not always the decisions you'd make with a clearer head, and he could not afford to make bad decisions about this. On the third day, a Thursday, he sat at his kitchen table after Mia left for school and called. Adeline picked up on the second ring. "Cole." "I've been thinking," he said. "So have I." A pause. He could hear the ambient sound of an office, faint keyboard, distant phone. "Are you free this weekend?" "Saturday afternoon. Mia goes to her grandmother's at noon." "Sophie has a standing appointment with her music teacher Saturday morning. She's done by 11:30. Another pause, shorter. "There's a park about halfway between your neighborhood and mine. Dunmore Park. There's a coffee cart near the east entrance." "I know the park." "Noon?" "Noon," he said. He got there at 11:45. Not because he was eager, or not only because of that, but because he didn't like arriving after the other person. An old habit from a professional context that had migrated into his personal life and never left. He got coffee from the cart, found a bench with sight lines to the entrance, and waited. Adeline arrived at noon exactly. She was dressed differently than the gala. Dark jeans, a plain gray sweater, her hair pulled back without the architectural precision it had carried at the estate. She looked like a person rather than a position, which he suspected took considerable effort for her even on weekends. She spotted him immediately, which told him she'd also scoped the location in advance, and she walked toward him without hesitation. "You were early," she said, sitting down at the other end of the bench. "I'm always early." "So am I usually." She looked at the coffee in her hand. "I made myself wait in the car for 8 minutes." He almost smiled. "Why?" "Because I didn't want to seem—" She stopped. "I don't know what I didn't want to seem. It's a ridiculous thing to be managing right now." "It's not ridiculous," he said. "It's just human." She looked at him sideways. "You're very calm about all of this." "I'm not calm," Cole said. "I'm controlled. There's a difference." She considered that. "What happens when the control runs out?" "Hasn't yet," he said. "Ask me again in a month." A jogger went past. A pair of older women walked a small dog. The park had that particular Saturday quality, unhurried, populated by people who had nowhere urgent to be, the specific piece of a city taking a breath. "I talked to a lawyer," Adeline said. Cole set his coffee down on the bench between them. "All right. Not to... I want to be clear about why." She turned to face him more directly. "Not to protect myself from you? To understand what the situation is legally, so I know what I'm working with. Information, not strategy." "What did the lawyer say?" "That paternity, once established, carries rights and responsibilities that neither party can simply opt out of. That a court would likely look favorably on a phased introduction given Sophie's age and the fact that she doesn't know yet." She paused. "And that I have significant legal exposure for the years of non-disclosure, if you chose to pursue it." "I'm not going to pursue it," Cole said. "You don't have to tell me that right now. You don't owe me." "I'm not telling you for your benefit," he said. "I'm telling you because it's true and I don't want it sitting in the air between us while we try to have a real conversation. Suing you doesn't get me a daughter. It gets me a legal process and a traumatized kid. I'm not interested in either." Adeline was quiet for a moment. "Most people in your position would be angry." "I am angry," Cole said evenly. "I'm angry that I missed 7 years. I'm angry that I didn't know. I'm angry at the specific set of circumstances that made it possible for two people who were both trying to do the right thing to end up here." He picked his coffee back up. "But anger at you specifically? I'm working on that. I don't have a clean answer yet." She absorbed that with the particular stillness of someone who has been preparing for something harder and found themselves unexpectedly disarmed by something honest. "Sophie asked about you," Adeline said. Cole looked at her. "What did she ask?" "She wanted to know who the man with the tattoo was. I told her you were someone I knew a long time ago." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "She asked if you were going to come back." The question sat there in the park air between them. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know yet." She met his eyes. "I wanted to have this conversation before I told her anything else." Cole nodded. He thought about how to say the next thing, because it needed to be said carefully. Not to spare Adeline, but because the subject of it was a 7-year-old with a heart condition and the instinct to run toward strangers who turned out to be her father, and she deserved to have the adults in her life handle this with some deliberateness. "I want to meet her properly," he said. "Not as a mechanic she ran into at an event, as someone you're introducing her to with context she can understand." "I agree. That means she needs to know something first. Not everything. Not yet. But something." Adeline looked at the path ahead of them. A kid on a bicycle wobbled past, training wheels still on, a man jogging alongside with one hand hovering near the seat. She watched them go. "I know," she said. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell her for 3 days. She's smart. She's extremely smart. That's part of what makes it complicated. She'll ask questions I don't have good answers for." "Then tell her that," Cole said. "Kids are better with, 'I don't have a good answer for that yet,' than adults think they are. What they're not good with is sensing that something's being hidden." Adeline looked at him. "You've had this conversation? With Mia?" "Not exactly this one," Cole said. "But Mia knows her parents didn't work out. She knows there were things that were complicated and that she'll understand more when she's older. She asked me once if I wished her mom and I had stayed together, and I told her the truth. That I wished we'd handled things better, but that if we'd handled them differently, she might not be here, so I couldn't wish too hard." He paused. "She was 5. She thought about it for about 30 seconds, and then asked if we could have pancakes." Adeline made a sound that might have been a laugh, small and involuntary. "Sophie would not let it go that easily?" "No," Cole agreed. "I don't think she would." The bench was warm from the afternoon sun. Cole leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at the middle distance, thinking about how strange it was to be sitting in a park on a Saturday, having the most consequential conversation of his adult life, with someone he'd once known completely and now barely knew at all, and was going to have to get to know again in an entirely different context. "Tell me about her," he said. "Whatever you want me to know before I meet her again." Adeline looked at him for a moment, checking, he thought, whether the question was genuine. Then she settled back slightly and started talking. Sophie was in 2nd grade at a private school 20 minutes from the Sterling House, which was a converted farmhouse on a large property north of the city. Adeline had chosen it specifically because it had land and a barn and the feeling of something real, which she'd wanted Sophie to grow up around rather than in the climate-controlled sterility of a penthouse. Sophie had strong opinions about animals, specifically that she wanted a horse, which Adeline had been negotiating against for 2 years on the grounds that a horse was a relationship commitment, not a purchase, and Sophie needed to demonstrate she could sustain responsibility before they discussed it. Sophie had responded to this argument by maintaining a rigorous watering schedule for 14 houseplants for the past 8 months, which Adeline described with a mixture of exasperation and unmistakable pride. She was currently learning violin, which she was technically proficient at, but emotionally uninterested in, and had recently begun lobbying for drums instead, which her music teacher supported and Adeline had complicated feelings about. She didn't like most foods that were green, with the inexplicable exception of edamame, which she ate compulsively whenever it was available. She was afraid of escalators, not elevators, specifically escalators, after an incident when she was 4 that had frightened her badly enough to leave a lasting impression. She slept with a stuffed elephant named Gerald, who was missing one eye and had been repaired so many times the seams were more patched than original fabric. Cole listened to all of it. He asked a few questions, small ones, practical ones, the kind of questions that come from actually listening rather than waiting for your turn to speak. Adeline answered each one, and the answers led to other information, and for a while they sat in the park talking about Sophie, the way 2 people talk about someone they both love from different directions, which is what they were. At some point during this, Cole realized that something had shifted in the quality of the conversation. The careful distance of the early part had dissolved into something more operational, more like 2 people figuring out a shared problem than 2 people managing a delicate negotiation. He didn't point it out. He just noted it. "She hasn't had a man in her life," Adeline said at a gap in the conversation. "I mean, I have male colleagues she's met. My CFO has come to dinners, but nobody consistent. Nobody who was—" She stopped. "I didn't date. After you. For a long time." She said it to the path rather than to him. "And then I was so busy building the company back up that it wasn't a priority I had space for." Cole thought about the woman he'd seen through the SUV window 8 years ago, or the woman at the SUV window had become. Armor assembled piece by piece out of professional achievement and controlled environment and careful distance from anything that might move without permission. "Were you lonely?" he asked. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. "Yes," she said finally, "but I was used to it by then. You get used to it. You shouldn't have to." "A lot of things shouldn't be the way they are," she said without self-pity. Just observation. They left the park at 2:15, stood on the pavement outside the east entrance, both of them apparently uncertain how to conclude an interaction that had covered more ground than either had expected. "I'll talk to Sophie this week," Adeline said. "I'll tell her that you're someone important to me from a long time ago and that I'd like her to meet you properly. I'll let her process that before we go further." "All right. And I'll have my assistant send you the information for Dr. Reyes. If you can get in for the blood work before the end of the month, she can factor it into Sophie's next review." "I'll make it work," Cole said. Adeline nodded. She had her keys in her hand. She looked like she was going to say something else, and then looked like she'd decided against it, and then looked like she'd changed her mind again. Cole waited. "For what it's worth," she said, "you turned out to be more than I was afraid of." He looked at her steadily. "What were you afraid of?" "Rage," she said simply. "Or indifference. Either one would have made this easier in some ways and impossible in others." She looked at him with the direct quality he remembered, the way she paid attention to things she actually wanted to understand. "You're neither." "Give me time," Cole said. "I told you the control has a shelf life." "I know." She said it without flinching, which he respected. "I'll be ready for it when it gets here." She drove away. He watched her car until it turned out of sight, and then he walked back to his truck and sat in it. And this time he didn't sit for as long as he had in the Whitmore Estate parking lot, because some things had moved from unknown to known, and he could feel the shape of what was ahead of him more clearly. Now, even if it was still complicated and still unresolved and still going to require things from him, he hadn't yet figured out how to give. He called his own doctor on the way home and made an appointment for a full genetic panel. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening, Adeline called him. He was in the shop, finishing up an oil change on a delivery truck. He had grease to his elbows and the phone propped against a toolbox on speaker because he'd developed the habit with Mia always calling after school. "She knows," Adeline said. Cole set down the wrench. "How did it go?" Silence for a moment on the line. Not the silence of someone composing themselves. The silence of someone who has been through something and is still inside it. "She cried," Adeline said. "Not because she was upset with me, she just cried. And I held her, and then she stopped and asked me what his name was. I told her Cole. She said that was a good name." Another pause. "Then she asked if you were the man from the garden." "What did you say?" "I said yes." Cole leaned against the side of the truck. He looked at the ceiling of his shop, the bare fluorescent lighting, the pegboard of tools, the absolutely ordinary surrounding of a Tuesday night in a working garage. "How is she now?" "She's fine. She's quieter than usual, which means she's processing." He could hear Adeline moving through a room, the soft sound of footsteps on hardwood. "She asked me one thing that I didn't know how to answer." "What?" "She asked why it took so long for you to find us." Adeline's voice was steady, but only just. "I told her it was complicated, and that it wasn't because you didn't want to." Cole closed his eyes for a second. "Thank you for that." "It's the truth." "I know. Thank you anyway." He heard a door close on Adeline's end. Her voice became slightly more private, quieter. She also said, and I want you to know this because I think you should hear it. She said, "I knew when I saw his tattoo. I just knew." Cole didn't say anything for a moment. 7 years old, he said. 7 years old, Adeline agreed. He went home that night and made dinner for Mia and helped her with a worksheet about fractions that she found deeply offensive as a concept, and watched half a cartoon with her before her bedtime. And after she was asleep, he sat on the porch in the cooling night air and stayed there for a long time. He was angry. He could feel it more clearly now that the immediate situation had moved forward enough to give the anger room to exist. It sat in his chest, not hot the way rage is hot, but dense and settled, the specific weight of 7 years of not knowing. 7 birthdays, 7 Christmases. First words that had already happened, and first steps he hadn't been there for, and the first day of school, and the first loose tooth, and whatever other landmarks he couldn't even name because he hadn't known to look for them. He'd missed all of it. And Adeline had seen him through a window holding another man's child, holding his own child by a different woman, and had made a decision based on incomplete information, which was the thing he understood rationally and could not yet fully forgive. He understood why. He had held her choices up against the facts she'd had available to her at each point, and he could trace the logic, could see how each decision had been made by someone trying to protect a child while surviving enormous pressure, and the logic held together in a way that left very little room for simple blame. That didn't make the weight in his chest any lighter. It just made it more complicated. He sat on the porch until midnight and thought about Sophie asking what took so long. He thought about what he would say to her the first time she asked him directly, because she would ask him directly. Adeline had made it clear that Sophie was the kind of child who asked things directly, and he believed it because he had the same quality and recognized where it came from. He would tell her the truth. A version of it appropriate to a 7-year-old, honest enough to hold up as she got older and could handle more. He would tell her that sometimes people get separated by things that are nobody's fault exactly, and that finding each other again matters more than what happened in between. He would tell her that he wished he had been there for the years he'd missed, and that he planned to be there for all the years ahead. He would tell her that missing someone you didn't know you had is a strange kind of grief, but that it was real, and that he had felt it for years without knowing what it was. He would tell her that she had been right in the garden, that she had known something he didn't yet know and had acted on it with the fearless instinct of someone who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of the answers. He planned to teach her to be proud of that quality rather than to sand it down. He planned to teach her a lot of things, actually. He was starting to make a list, the way he made lists when he was planning a complex job. Not obsessively, just clearly, so he knew what he was working with and what needed to happen in what order. Sophie's medical history first. Then an introduction, properly done, in a setting where she had space and felt safe. Then whatever came after that, one piece at a time, without trying to compress 7 years into 7 weeks. It was 3 days after that midnight porch session that things shifted again, and not gently. Cole was in the waiting room of Dr. Reyes's office. He'd gone in to deliver his completed blood work results in person rather than by portal, because he trusted face-to-face conversations more than digital summaries for anything that actually mattered, when the doctor came out herself rather than sending a nurse. Dr. Reyes was a compact woman in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the manner of someone who had delivered difficult information enough times to have developed a specific way of sitting before she did it. She sat across from Cole in the consultation room and opened Sophie's file. "Mr. Harrington," she said, "thank you for coming in. The results you've provided are genuinely useful." "But," Cole said. She looked at him with the direct appreciation of a professional who encounters people who want the unvarnished version. "The marker we identified in Sophie is consistent with a form of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that in most cases is well managed with medication and monitoring. Your genetic panel confirms the hereditary pathway. It came through your family line, which means we now understand the mechanism more completely." "What does that change?" "It changes the treatment picture significantly." She set down the file. "The protocol we had Sophie on was conservative because we were working with incomplete data. Now that we know the specific variant, there are 2 modifications that would likely improve her long-term outcome. One is a medication adjustment. Straightforward, low risk. We can implement it at her next appointment. The other is a monitoring protocol that we'd want to establish now while she's young, which means regular echocardiograms on a specific schedule." She paused. "Without your history, we might not have identified the variant for years. Or we might have eventually, but later is always worse in cardiac cases involving children." Cole sat with that for a moment. He thought about the word years. He thought about what later means when you're measuring it against a child's heart. "Is she in danger?" he said. "Not acutely, no. Sophie is not in any immediate crisis. But children with unmanaged or undermanaged hypertrophic cardiomyopathy can develop complications in adolescence when the heart is under different physical stress. What you've given us today significantly reduces the probability of that outcome." Dr. Reyes looked at him over her glasses with the frankness of someone who has seen too much to soften things past usefulness. "You came in for this promptly. That matters." Cole drove to the park again after leaving the doctor's office. Not Dunmore Park, a different one, smaller, near his shop, where he sometimes went to eat lunch when the walls of the garage felt close. He sat on a bench and looked at nothing particular and let the full weight of what the doctor had told him settle into place. The medical history that Adeline had needed for Sophie, that Sophie had needed, he had been walking around with it in his cells for 37 years without knowing it was needed. The variant in his genetic line that was now restructuring his daughter's treatment plan had been there all along, patient and inert and impossible to deploy without his participation. He thought about the 7 years. He thought about Sophie's heart beating through all of them without the full picture. He thought about what Dr. Reyes had said, later is always worse, and he sat with the specific flavor of that thought, which wasn't quite rage and not quite grief, but some compound of the two that didn't have a clean name in any language he knew. Then he called Adeline. She picked up in one ring. "Cole? Is everything all right?" "I talked to Dr. Reyes," he said. A beat. "And?" "She needs to hear this from you. Make an appointment with her. Soon." He kept his voice level. "The blood work changed things. Sophie's treatment plan needs to be updated, and it should happen quickly." He heard Adeline's breathing shift on the line. The small change of someone who has been braced and then feels the thing they were braced for arrive. "How significant?" "Significant enough that the doctor said it herself without me asking." He paused. "Sophie is going to be all right. I want you to hear that clearly. But she could be more all right, with the right information, and now they have it." The silence on the other end lasted longer than the previous ones. Cole waded through it. "Cole, don't," he said. It came out with more edge than he intended, or maybe exactly as much as he intended. "Don't apologize right now. I'm not ready for it yet, and I don't want to say something I'll regret." Another silence. "Okay," Adeline said quietly. "Call Dr. Reyes today," he said. "Get the appointment scheduled. Send me the date, and I'll be there if she needs me to be." "She would probably want you there." "Then I'll be there," he said. "That's what I'm going to keep doing. I'm going to keep being there. That's the decision I've made, and it doesn't change regardless of what I'm working through on my own time." He ended the call. He stayed on the bench for another 20 minutes. A pigeon walked in deliberate circles near his feet with the focused purposefulness of an animal that has nowhere specific to be and finds this completely acceptable. Cole watched it without seeing it, his hands clasped between his knees, the same posture he'd held in the East Wing sitting room at the Whitmore estate, feeling the specific gravity of a life rearranging itself around a new center of weight. His daughter had a heart that needed his history to be fully cared for. He had that history. He had always had it. He had simply not known, for 7 years, that someone was waiting for it. He stood up from the bench, picked up his jacket, and walked back to the shop where there was still work to be done, and an afternoon not yet finished, carrying the anger and the grief and the steady, unshakable decision that sat underneath both of them, like bedrock. The appointment with Dr. Reyes was on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after Cole's blood work came back. Adeline had sent him the date the same evening he'd called her from the bench near the shop. No additional message, just the date, time, and the clinic's address. He had replied with a single word, confirmed, and that was the entirety of their communication for the next 18 days, which was not avoidance exactly, but more like two people giving each other room to breathe inside a situation that required breathing space. Cole drove himself to the clinic. Adeline and Sophie were already in the waiting room when he arrived. Sophie in a green jacket with her braids redone tighter than they'd been at the gala, sitting with her feet dangling off the edge of the waiting room chair and a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading. She was watching the door. She saw Cole come in before Adeline did. She sat very still and watched him cross the waiting room toward them with the particular focused quality he was beginning to recognize as distinctly hers. Not shy, not uncertain, just gathering information before acting on it. He stopped a few feet away and crouched down to her eye level, the way he did with Mia when there was something that needed to be said without the height differential making it feel like a lecture. "Hey, Sophie," he said. "Hey," she said. Up close, in daylight, the resemblance was clearer than it had been in the garden, not overwhelming. She had Adeline's coloring, Adeline's mouth, but the eyes were his. That particular gray-green that people sometimes called hazel because they couldn't settle on one answer, and the way she held his gaze steady without blinking too much, was a quality he'd seen in the mirror often enough to know where it came from. "Your mom said you like to build things," he said. She considered this. I like to know how things work, she said, with the mild correction of someone for whom the distinction mattered. Building is part of that. Fair enough, Cole said. She looked down at his wrist, where the tattoo was partially visible below his jacket cuff. She looked back up at him. Mom explained about the tattoo, she said. What did she tell you? That you got it together, a long time ago, when you were important to each other. She said it with the careful precision of a child who has memorized phrasing because she understands it matters. She said it means something about starting over. Cole looked over at Adeline, who was watching this exchange with her hands folded in her lap, and an expression he didn't try to interpret. He looked back at Sophie. That's right, he said. That's what it means. Sophie nodded once, firmly, in the manner of someone filing information correctly. Okay, she said, and looked back at her book, which was apparently all the confirmation she needed for that particular question before moving on to whatever the next one was. Cole straightened up. Adeline had stood while he was crouched with Sophie, and they were briefly face to face at the same height in the middle of the waiting room, the way they'd been briefly too close in the estate sitting room, and this time neither of them stepped back. Thank you for coming, she said. I told you I would, he said. The appointment lasted an hour and 20 minutes. Dr. Reyes went through the updated protocol with Adeline first, then had Sophie brought in for the portion she needed to be present for, which the doctor handled with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years explaining complex things to children without condescension. Sophie asked 2 questions, both of them precise and unexpected enough that Dr. Reyes paused before answering each one. Cole sat in the corner of the consultation room and said nothing, and watched his daughter interact with the world, and felt something move through him that was not yet comfortable enough to name. Afterward, in the clinic parking lot, Sophie walked ahead of them toward Adeline's car. She had apparently decided she was done with the waiting room book, and was now balancing along the painted line at the edge of the parking space with her arms out. How are you doing? Adeline asked, not looking at Cole, watching Sophie. I'm all right, he said. That's not what I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Sophie stepped off the line, reconsidered, stepped back on. I'm functioning, he said. That's the honest answer. Adeline nodded. She appeared to accept that as sufficient. She wants to see you again, she said. She hasn't said it directly, but I know her. She's going to ask tomorrow morning, and I'd rather know what to tell her. Cole watched Sophie attempt a particularly ambitious stretch of the painted line and nearly lose her balance and recover without acknowledging the near miss. Tell her she can, he said, if you're comfortable with it. I'm working on comfortable, Adeline said. But yes. They arranged it before they left the parking lot. A Saturday 2 weeks out, somewhere neutral, somewhere that had enough for a 7-year-old to engage with, so the pressure of the interaction was distributed across activity rather than concentrated in pure conversation. Cole suggested the Children's Science Museum downtown, which he knew because Mia had dragged him there 4 times in 6 months, and he had, against his original expectations, come to genuinely enjoy it. Adeline agreed, and the arrangement was made in the plain transactional language of 2 people focused on logistics, because logistics were manageable in a way that feelings were not yet. He told Mia that night. He had been putting it off, not dishonestly. Mia knew something was on his mind. She always did. She had her mother's sensitivity to other people's emotional weather. But because he hadn't found the right moment, and because the right moment for a conversation like this needed to be found rather than forced. They were doing dishes after dinner, Mia on a step stool to reach the sink, Cole drying. This was their system. Mia washed, badly and enthusiastically, and Cole dried and quietly rewashed anything that still had food on it, which was most things. There's something I want to tell you, he said. Mia handed him a dripping bowl. Is it good or bad? It's both, he said, depending on how you look at it. She thought about this seriously, the way she thought about things that seemed designed to be contradictory. Okay, she said, tell me. He told her. He kept it simple because she was 7, and because simple was truer than complicated in this case. There was a little girl named Sophie, who was his daughter, who he hadn't known about until recently, who was going to become part of their lives. He told her that Sophie had a mother named Adeline, who Cole knew a long time ago. He told her that things were complicated, but that the important part was that Sophie was family. Mia was quiet through all of this. She washed a mug with intense focus that he recognized as her processing expression. Do I have to share my room? She said finally. No, Cole said. She lives with her mom. She's not moving in. Okay. Mia handed him the mug. Does she like building things? I think she likes knowing how things work, Cole said. So probably yes. Mia appeared to find this acceptable. She was quiet for a little longer and then said, without looking up from the dishes, Is she like your other daughter or like your first daughter? Cole set the mug down. She's my daughter, he said. Same as you. Mia looked up at him. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown and direct, and she used them with the thoroughness of someone twice her age. She appeared to be checking whether he meant it. Both, she said. Both, he confirmed. She turned back to the sink. A minute passed, dishes moving between them. Can she come over sometime? Mia asked. Cole picked up the mug and dried it carefully. Yeah, he said. I think she can. The Science Museum on a Saturday was exactly as chaotic as Cole remembered from the Mia expeditions. Families in every direction, kids running between exhibits, the particular decibel level of a building full of people who are excited and not trying to moderate it. I was there first. Again. Not because he was anxious, but because he was himself. Sophie arrived with Adeline at 11 sharp. She was in jeans this time and a red sweatshirt, and she had one braid in and one braid out because, Adeline would explain later, rolling her eyes with the affection of sustained exasperation. She had done them herself that morning and refused assistance. She spotted Cole at the entrance and walked toward him with the directness she'd shown in the waiting room. No running this time, just purpose. You came, she said. Said I would, he said. She looked at him for a moment with that gathering expression. Mom says you fix things, engines and stuff. Yeah. Do you know how they work, or just how to fix them when they're broken? Cole considered this. It was the kind of question that seemed simple and wasn't. Both, he said. You can't fix something you don't understand. Sophie absorbed this with a nod that suggested it had confirmed something she already suspected. That's what I thought, she said, and turned toward the museum entrance like the interview was concluded and they could proceed to the actual day. He watched Adeline watch this exchange with something that was clearly suppressed amusement and something else underneath it that was harder to categorize and that he didn't examine too closely. They went through the museum in the order Sophie dictated, which turned out to be nonlinear and based on a logic Cole could follow, but Adeline admitted she could not. Sophie had been here before and had opinions about which exhibits were worth time and which ones were, in her assessment, mostly pretending to be more interesting than they are, which she said in the frank tone of a critic who has no interest in softening her view. She spent 25 minutes at the mechanical engineering section, gears and pulleys and the physics of simple machines, and Cole found himself actually teaching, which happened naturally, without a decision being made about it, just the way it happens when someone is curious and you know the answers. Why does a bigger gear go slower, she asked, at a demonstration model. Because it has more teeth to move through each rotation, Cole said. More distance per turn. More distance means more time. She stared at the gears turning. But it has more power. Right. You trade speed for force, or force for speed. You can't have both from the same input. She thought about this for a while. That's true about other things too, she said. Yeah, Cole said. It kind of is. Adeline was standing slightly behind them, and he didn't look at her, but he was aware of her the way you're aware of someone who has gone very still. Lunch was at the museum cafe. Sandwiches, chips, lemonade that Sophie declared too sweet but drank anyway. Sophie sat across from Cole and asked him questions with the methodical consistency of someone working through a list, though it wasn't a list, just a natural progression of curiosity that moved from his work to his truck to whether he had any animals to what he did when things were broken beyond repair. I figure out what's salvageable, Cole said to that last one. Most things that seem too broken to fix have at least one part that still works. You start there. Sophie ate a chip. What if nothing works? Then you figure out what the broken thing was made of and whether those materials are useful for something new. She looked at him over her lemonade cup. You're talking about more than engines, she said. Cole looked at this 7-year-old who had just caught him using a metaphor he hadn't consciously intended and felt something shift in his chest that was too large and too sudden to be entirely comfortable. Yeah, he said. I guess I am. Sophie nodded as if this were the expected answer and reached for another chip. Adeline excused herself to get more napkins, and Cole suspected she did it to give herself 30 seconds of space, and he didn't blame her. They left the museum at 3 in the afternoon. The parking lot was blinding in the flat October light. Sophie had a paper model of a gear system she'd assembled at one of the hands-on stations, holding it carefully with both hands, and she paused at the point where they'd have to go in different directions toward their respective cars. She looked at Cole. He could see her making a decision. "Will you come again?" she said. "If you want me to," he said. "I want you to," she said, with the clean simplicity of a child who hasn't yet learned to disguise what she wants as something more casual. "Then I will." She looked satisfied. She turned to Adeline. "Can we go see his shop sometime?" Adeline blinked. We'd have to ask Cole." "It's fine with me," Cole said. "Whenever you want." Sophie tucked the gear model under her arm. "Okay," she said. "Next time." And she walked toward the car like it was settled, because to her it was. The next 6 weeks moved differently than Cole expected. He had anticipated the process of becoming Sophie's father to feel like crossing a long distance, difficult terrain, progress measured in painful increments. What he hadn't anticipated was the pace at which Sophie decided she was done with careful and moved to something that looked more like normal, at a speed that suggested she had been waiting a long time for something to be normal and wasn't interested in slow-walking it now that it had arrived. She came to the shop on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks after the museum, with Adeline, as arranged. She wore her green jacket again and stood in the middle of the garage and looked at everything with the thorough attention of a building inspector, touching nothing, asking questions about everything. Cole's 2 employees, Danny, 26, who was easily thrown by unusual situations, and George, 53, who was thrown by nothing, both responded to her with the particular helplessness of adults confronted by a child who is more composed than they are. George showed her where the tools were organized. Danny let her look through the glass at an engine he was midway through rebuilding. She asked Danny why he'd taken that specific component out, and he explained, and she said, "But wouldn't it be easier to access the one behind it if you went in from the other side?" And Danny stared at her, and then at the engine, and then at Cole, who shrugged, and Danny said, "Huh," and tried it, and found that she was correct. "She's going to be an engineer," George said to Cole later, out of Sophie's earshot. "She's going to be whatever she decides to be," Cole said. George looked at him over his reading glasses. George had known Cole for 2 years and was not fooled by his stoicism any more than Danny was, just better at pretending to be. "She looks like you around the eyes," he said. "I know," Cole said. "Good thing," George said, and went back to the invoice he was working on. Cole had not talked to Adeline about what they were. The 2 of them, the thing between them that existed separate from Sophie, in the space that had started as 10 years of complicated history and was becoming something less defined and more present. They were in contact constantly now, which was necessary and also something else. She texted him updates about Sophie's appointments. He texted her when something came up that she'd want to know. Sophie had asked him a question about his time in the military. He'd answered it simply and wanted Adeline to know what was said. She'd called him once at 9 in the evening, not about Sophie at all, but because there was a situation at the company involving a board member who was making things difficult. And he'd asked halfway through the call if she had anyone to talk to about it, meaning someone in her life rather than her legal team, and she'd been quiet for a moment before saying, "Not really," and he'd said, "Okay, keep talking then," and she had, for another 40 minutes. He thought about that call at odd moments, what it meant that she had called him, what it meant that he had asked her to keep talking. He didn't examine it too hard yet, because there was still enough unresolved between them that romantic clarity felt like getting ahead of himself. And he had learned from long experience that getting ahead of yourself in any situation was how you made mistakes you then had to unmake under worse conditions. But he thought about it. On a Sunday in late November, he had both girls. It had been arranged tentatively. Mia's grandmother had canceled a visit, which had freed Mia's day, and Sophie had asked the previous week whether she was ever going to meet Mia, and Adeline had looked at Cole, and Cole had said there was only one way to find out. So they came to his house, both of them, Adeline included, which was the first time anyone outside of Janet had been in his house since he'd moved in, a fact that said something about his life that he was aware of and not proud of. The house was clean. Not performatively clean, just the functional clean of someone who keeps things in order because disorder costs you time, and time is the resource he was most careful with. Mia had made a sign for the front door that said, "Welcome" in crayon, the E having been accidentally omitted. And when Cole pointed this out, she examined it and said it was close enough and he had not argued. Sophie read the sign on the way in and looked at Mia and said, "You forgot the E." Mia said, "I know, I ran out of room." Sophie thought about this and nodded. "That's a reasonable problem," she said. And that was it. Whatever adjustment period Cole had been preparing himself to manage evaporated in the first 30 seconds, because Mia was constitutionally incapable of being around another child without immediately recruiting them into whatever project she was currently running. And the current project was a cardboard city she'd been building in the living room for 2 weeks, and Sophie looked at it and saw something that needed solving, a structural issue with the central tower. And they were on the floor with tape and scissors within 4 minutes of arrival. Cole stood in the doorway of his own living room and watched his 2 daughters argue pleasantly about load-bearing walls in a cardboard city, and felt the specific dislocation of someone whose life has changed so completely in such a short time that the present moment looks nothing like the one they were living 10 weeks ago. Adeline came to stand beside him. She'd been in the kitchen, having offered to make coffee, having been directed to where everything was with the careful neutrality of a guest who was trying not to notice too much about the home of someone she didn't fully know yet. She handed him a cup. He took it. They stood in the doorway and watched the girls. "Mia's very confident," Adeline said. "Terrifyingly so," Cole said. "Sophie's never had another kid around like that. She's used to being the smartest person in her immediate environment and having everyone respond to that." She watched Sophie try to make a case for her tower solution, and Mia override it with a completely different proposal, and Sophie genuinely consider the counterargument rather than simply defending her own. "This is good for her. Mia needs someone who'll hold their ground with her," Cole said. "She runs everyone over without meaning to. They're going to be either great friends or exhausting rivals," Adeline said. "Probably both," Cole said. The afternoon went long. Cole made lunch, and neither girl noticed or cared that they ate it on the floor next to the cardboard city, because relocating to the table would have required pausing the project, which was not under consideration. Adeline sat on the couch with a cup of tea and had the particular look of someone who has spent most of their life managing environments and has unexpectedly encountered one they don't need to manage. At one point, while Adeline was helping Sophie fix a section of the city's outer wall, Mia climbed up onto the couch next to Cole and leaned against his arm in the absent, unself-conscious way she'd always done since she was small, and said quietly, not making a performance of it, "I like her." "Sophie?" "Yeah." Mia looked at Sophie across the room. "She knows stuff, but she doesn't act like it's to make you feel bad." "No," Cole agreed. "She doesn't." Mia leaned a little heavier. "Are we going to do this more?" "Yeah," Cole said. "We are." Mia appeared satisfied. She slid off the couch and went back to the city. Later, after Adeline and Sophie had gone and Mia was in the bath, Cole sat at his kitchen table with the day still in the room, the way days are when something significant has happened in them. The coffee cups were in the sink. One of Sophie's hair ties had been left on the floor by the living room, a small purple elastic, and he picked it up and set it on the counter in the particular careful way of someone who knows that small things left behind are a kind of promise. He was building something. He understood that now, with the clarity that comes after enough concrete days have passed to see the shape of what they're accumulating toward. It wasn't built yet. There were too many unresolved questions, too much history still sitting between him and Adeline, like furniture in a room they were learning to move around, the anger that came in waves and the grief that came in quieter waves, and the complicated admiration for how she had survived, and the complicated resentment for what the survival had cost him. None of that was clean. None of it would be clean for a while. But Sophie had left a hair tie on his floor, and Mia had said "I like her" with the blunt sincerity of a child who hasn't learned yet to say things she doesn't mean, and Cole had watched his 2 daughters argue about cardboard architecture on a Sunday afternoon in November, and something in all of that was more solid than anything he'd built in a long time. He was still angry on certain mornings. He was also, on certain afternoons, starting to believe that the thing being assembled from the wreckage of a decade of misunderstanding was something worth the difficulty of assembling it. That wasn't resolution. That wasn't forgiveness fully arrived at. It was something more like an understanding that resolution was possible, which was different from where he'd started, and was, for now, enough to work with. He put Sophie's hair tie in the small dish on the counter where he kept things that belonged to Mia: a button from a coat, a library card, a folded drawing of a horse, and went to check on his daughter. The paternity paperwork was finalized on a Thursday in December in a lawyer's office that smelled like old carpet and fresh coffee, with a potted plant in the corner that was doing its best against the fluorescent lighting and not entirely winning. Cole signed where indicated. Adeline signed where indicated. The lawyer, a quiet man named Forsyth, who had the manner of someone who had witnessed enough human complexity to be unsurprisable, notarized the documents with the mechanical efficiency of a person who understood that the weight of what was on the paper had nothing to do with how long it took to stamp it. It was not a dramatic moment, the signing. Cole had expected to feel something seismic when it happened, and instead felt something quieter. The specific satisfaction of a thing that has been true for a long time finally being acknowledged in a form the world could recognize. Sophie was his daughter on paper now, the way she had been his daughter, in fact, since a November morning 8 years ago, when she had arrived in a world that didn't yet know to tell him about her. Adeline held the finalized copy of the document and looked at it for a moment before putting it in her bag. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They walked out of the building into a December afternoon that was cold and flat and gray in the specific way that December afternoons are in this part of the country. Not dramatically cold, just the persistent, settled cold of a season that has arrived and intends to stay. Cole buttoned his jacket. Adeline pulled her coat tighter. "Sophie wants to tell her class," Adeline said. Cole looked at her. "Tell them what?" "That she has a father now." A pause. "I told her she could decide for herself what to share and what not to." She glanced at him sideways. "She's planning an announcement." "Of course she is," Cole said. "I thought you should know." "I'm honored," he said, and he meant it without irony, which surprised him slightly. They stood on the pavement outside the lawyer's office building in the December cold, and Adeline looked up the street at nothing in particular, and Cole looked at the same piece of nothing, and between them was a document that had just changed both their lives in the most official way available to it, and also a decade of history and a 7-year-old girl, and two people who were still figuring out the distance between where they'd been and where they were now, and whether it was crossable. "Come for dinner," Adeline said. Not a question exactly, not quite an invitation, more like the statement of an option she was making available and leaving entirely to him. Cole looked at her. She was looking at the street still, her profile composed in the December light, and he understood that the offer was serious and that it cost her something to make it, because she had spent years building a life she controlled, and inviting someone into it was a form of risk she had not taken in a long time. "What time?" he said. She looked at him then. Something in her face settled. "6, she said. "I'll be there at 6, he said. He was there at 5:55, which was his version of 6, and he brought a bottle of wine he'd asked George about because George was the only person he knew who had opinions about wine, and also a small bag of edamame from the grocery store because Adeline had told him about it in the park, and he had not forgotten. Sophie opened the door before he knocked. She was clearly stationed there. "You brought edamame," she said, looking at the bag. "I heard it was a priority," Cole said. She took the bag with both hands and turned toward the house interior. "Mom, he brought edamame!" she called, disappearing into the hallway. Cole stepped inside. The house was what Adeline had described, a converted farmhouse, warmth from real wood rather than design magazine staging, rooms that looked like people actually lived in them rather than posed for photographs in them. There were books stacked on real surfaces, a mudroom with actual mud on the boots in it, Sophie's violin case leaning against the wall, and next to it, in a development that he suspected was recent, a pair of drumsticks on the shelf above it. "She wore me down," Adeline said, appearing from the kitchen, an apron over her work clothes, which was a detail he found quietly remarkable about her. That she cooked after the day she'd had, that she had apparently simply come home and started making dinner as if that were the obvious thing to do. "On the drums. She starts lessons in January." "Good," Cole said. "It's going to be very loud." "Worth it," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then nodded, accepting this verdict, and turned back to the kitchen. Dinner was pasta and salad and bread from a bakery Sophie had strong opinions about, eaten at a kitchen table that had the reassuring density of furniture that has been used regularly and not just owned. Sophie talked most of the time, which suited Cole fine. He was good at listening, always had been, and Sophie's conversation was worth listening to. She had decided to learn about engines because of the shop visit, she announced, and had been watching videos about internal combustion online, and she had a question about why two-stroke engines were more efficient in some applications than four-stroke, which Cole answered and which led to a 20-minute side conversation that Adeline sat through with the patient expression of someone who is entirely lost and entirely happy to be so. At some point, Adeline refilled Cole's wine without asking whether he wanted more, the casual familiarity of someone moving in her own space, and he noticed it and said nothing, and she noticed that he'd noticed and also said nothing, and it was the kind of exchange that doesn't need words to be understood. After dinner, Sophie showed Cole her room, which was the exact controlled chaos he would have predicted. Books arranged by height rather than author, a corkboard of things she found interesting, including a schematic of a gear system she'd apparently drawn herself after the museum visit. 14 houseplants in various states of thriving because she had maintained the watering schedule long past the point of proving anything to anyone. A stuffed elephant on the bed with mismatched button eyes that had clearly been repaired multiple times. "Is that Gerald?" Cole asked. Sophie stopped. "Mom told you about Gerald?" She might have mentioned him. Sophie picked up the elephant and looked at him with the seriousness of someone conducting an evaluation. "He's old," she said. "He's been fixed a lot." "Things that get fixed a lot are usually the most important ones," Cole said. Sophie looked at Gerald and then at Cole. "That's what I think too," she said. She set the elephant back on the bed with the care of someone returning something that has mattered for a long time to exactly the right position. He drove home at 9:30, after Sophie had been put to bed, and he and Adeline had sat in the kitchen with the cleared table between them and talked for an hour about nothing urgent. His shop, her company, the board member situation that had resolved less dramatically than it might have, Mia's cardboard city, which had reached a scale that was beginning to compromise navigating the living room. It was conversation without an agenda, which was something they hadn't had yet, and it moved the way those conversations do when two people are discovering that they actually like each other, which is different from knowing that they matter to each other, and both things can be true at once. He drove home and checked on Mia, who was asleep with one arm thrown over the edge of the bed in the abandonment of deep sleep, and he sat on the edge of her mattress for a minute in the dark, the way he did sometimes, not doing anything, just being there, in the specific way that fathers are there in the dark when children don't need anything except to be near someone who loves them. He thought about what was being built. He thought about it the way he thought about complex mechanical jobs. Not the finished product, but the process, the sequence, the way each correctly completed step creates the conditions for the next one. Families are not assembled all at once. They accumulate. They are made of small, correct decisions, and Tuesday dinners and questions answered honestly, and hair ties left on floors, and the willingness to come back after difficult days and do it again. He had missed 7 years of accumulation. Understood now, more fully than he had in the beginning, that there was no recovering those years. They existed the way all lost time exists, permanently behind you, accessible only through what it left on the people who lived through it. Sophie had lived through those years and been shaped by them, and who she was now included the mark of having been raised by a woman who fought for her alone. And Cole would not have wished that differently, even if he could, because Sophie was exactly who she was, and he would not trade that for any version of her shaped by different circumstances. What he could do was be here for everything from now on. That was the only arithmetic available to him, and he had accepted it without entirely making peace with it, because acceptance and peace are not the same thing, and he was honest enough with himself not to confuse them. January came in hard, colder than December had promised, and with it came Sophie's first drum lesson, which she reported to Cole by text. Adeline had given Sophie her own phone for emergencies, and Sophie had immediately determined that updates about drums constituted an emergency, in the form of a voice message that was mostly drumstick sounds, and Sophie's voice saying, "This is what I learned," and then a rhythmic pattern that was genuinely not bad for a first lesson. Cole played it twice in the shop, and George pretended not to notice. He had a routine now that he hadn't had before, which was the word he used for it because structure was how he managed things that mattered. Tuesdays, he picked Sophie up from school and took her to the shop, where she had claimed a corner of the office as a workspace and was currently teaching herself mechanical drawing from a library book, occasionally asking Cole questions that required him to think before answering. Saturdays when he had Mia, both girls were together more often than not. Sometimes at his house, sometimes at Adeline's, the specific geography rotating on the basis of logistics, and whoever had the more compelling activity on offer. Sophie and Mia had achieved the relationship Adeline had predicted, simultaneously great friends and exhausting rivals, competing over everything and defending each other against everything external with a ferocity that had emerged so quickly it seemed to come from somewhere biological rather than learned. There was a Tuesday in February when Cole arrived at Sophie's school and she came out with a boy behind her, a kid her age, compact and nervous looking, who Sophie introduced as Davis and then explained with clinical brevity that Davis had told another kid that Sophie didn't have a real dad, and Sophie had corrected this factually, and Davis had been surprised and wanted to apologize. Davis looked at Cole with the expression of a 7-year-old confronting a situation above his pay grade. "Sorry," he said, in the direction of Cole's kneecaps. "No problem," Cole said. Davis fled. Sophie watched him go and then looked up at Cole. "I told him you were in the Navy," she said. "Was that okay to say?" "It's fine," Cole said. "It's true. I didn't say what you did. I didn't know what I was allowed to say." Cole crouched down to her level. "You can say anything that's true," he said. "You don't have to defend me to anyone, but if you want to, you can." Sophie appeared to store this in the category of correct information. "Okay," she said. "Then, what did you do? In the Navy?" "Protected people," Cole said. "Went into places where things were dangerous and tried to make them less dangerous." "How?" "Different ways, depending on the situation." She looked at him steadily. "Did you get hurt?" "Yes," he said, "a few times." She processed this. "Is that why you left?" "Partly," he said. "Partly I left because I wanted a different kind of life. The protecting people part. I didn't want to stop doing that. I just wanted to do it closer to home." Sophie was quiet for a moment. The school parking lot moved around them, parents collecting kids, backpacks swinging. "You protect us," she said. Not a question. "Yeah," Cole said. "That's the job now." She looked at him for another second. That gathering expression, information being filed. Then she picked up her backpack from the ground where she'd dropped it and said, "Can we stop at the shop? I want to show George what I drew," and headed toward his truck with the decision apparently fully made. Cole stood up and followed her, and thought about how the most important things in his life had a way of being stated simply and moved on from quickly, which was perhaps as it should be, because the simple things are usually the ones that don't need a lot of words around them. The conversation he'd been having with himself about Adeline, the one that had been running underneath everything else for months, patient and persistent, arrived at something like a conclusion on an evening in late February when Sophie was at a classmate's birthday party, and Cole had come by to drop off something Sophie had left in the truck, and Adeline had invited him in because it was cold, and the something could wait while she made tea. They sat at the kitchen table again, which had become their table in the way that certain pieces of furniture and shared lives become specific locations for specific kinds of conversation. The tea was something Adeline had ordered from somewhere that Cole did not understand but found he didn't mind. "Can I ask you something?" Cole said. "You usually just ask," Adeline said. "You don't usually ask if you can ask." "This is different." She set her cup down. She looked at him with the full directness she gave to things that actually mattered. "Ask," she said. "What are we doing?" he said. It came out plainer than he'd planned, which was probably how it needed to come out. "You and me. Outside of Sophie. I need to know what you think is happening because I have a version of it in my head, and I don't know if it's the same version you have." Adeline was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone stalling, the quiet of someone being careful. "What's your version?" she said. "That we're not starting over," he said, "because you can't start over from something that happened, but that we're building something. That's different, that uses different materials." He looked at his hands on the table. "I'm not talking about what we were. I'm talking about what we might be, which I think is a separate question." Adeline turned her cup in her hands. She had a tell. He'd noticed it over months, where she turned things with her hands when she was deciding how honest to be, as if the physical movement bought her time to locate the truest version of what she wanted to say. "I've been afraid to want it," she said. "That's the honest answer. I've spent 10 years building a life where wanting things and not getting them wasn't a risk I took. Because I was the only..." Sophie needed me to function, and functioning meant not. She stopped. Tried again. I'm not practiced at wanting things for myself. I know, Cole said. I don't know how to do this, she said. Whatever this is. I know how to run a company. I know how to manage crises. I know how to be Sophie's mother. I don't know how to. She gestured between them, a small, uncharacteristic gesture that showed something unmanaged underneath the composure. Neither do I, Cole said. I've been managing my own life in a box for 3 years. Put the walls up after I left the SEALs because I was tired of things blowing up, and I thought if I kept everything small enough, it would all hold together. He looked at her directly. Then a 7-year-old ran across a garden and blew up the box, and I've been standing in the wreckage ever since, figuring out whether that's a disaster or the best thing that ever happened to me. Adeline looked at him for a long moment. Which is it? She said. Best thing, he said, by a significant margin. Her expression did the thing it occasionally did, where something underneath the composure broke the surface, not breaking down, just becoming suddenly and completely real, the face of the actual woman rather than the constructed one. She pressed her lips together and looked at the table and then back at him. I'm still angry sometimes, she said, at myself. For the years you missed. It doesn't go away. I know that feeling from a different angle, he said. I don't know what to do with it. You carry it, Cole said, and you do the next right thing while you're carrying it. And after enough time, the carrying gets easier. It doesn't go away, but it gets easier. He paused. That's the only wisdom I have on the subject, and it applies to most things I've been through. She looked at him for a long time. The kitchen was quiet around them, the February dark pressed against the windows, the house empty of anyone else, and full of everything that had accumulated in the months since a garden and a tattoo and a 7-year-old certainty had set all of this in motion. Okay, Adeline said. Okay, what? Okay, let's build something, she said, whatever that means. However long it takes to figure out what it is. She said it with the measured resolution of someone making a decision they've already made and are now choosing to say out loud. I want to try. So do I, Cole said. They did not kiss. They did not suddenly become something fully formed. What happened was considerably less cinematic and considerably more real. Adeline refilled his tea. Cole asked about the board situation that had come up again. They talked for another 2 hours about things that mattered and things that didn't, and when he left at 9:30, she stood at the door and he said goodnight, and she said drive safe, and it was ordinary in the specific way that things become ordinary when they are becoming part of your life. He drove home in the February dark with the heater running and the particular quiet of someone who has said something true and had it received truly, and thought about the fact that most of the significant things in his life had begun with something small. A deployment that ended wrong. A window he happened to look through. A 7-year-old who ran. Spring came the way it always does in this part of the country. Reluctantly at first, then suddenly, then with a completeness that made winter feel like something that happened a long time ago to different people. Sophie's medication adjustment proved out across the months in exactly the way Dr. Reyes had predicted. Her energy levels stabilized. The occasional arrhythmia episodes reduced in frequency and then stopped appearing in the monitoring data altogether. At her April appointment, Dr. Reyes used the word excellent with the precision of a doctor who uses that word sparingly, and Sophie, who had been in the room for the summary portion, said, I know, with the unnerving confidence of someone who had been paying attention to her own body all along and simply needed the data to catch up. Cole was there for the appointment. He had been to all of them. This had become part of the rhythm. His name on the forms, his presence in the waiting room, his voice asking the follow-up questions that he'd learned from the previous appointments. The nurses knew him by name now. Dr. Reyes addressed her summaries to both him and Adeline with the easy equivalence of someone for whom this family configuration had become the baseline. On the drive back from the April appointment, Sophie sat in the back seat of Adeline's car and was unusually quiet, which always meant something was being processed. Cole was in the passenger seat. They were most of the way home before Sophie spoke. Cole, she said. He turned to look at her. Yeah. Can I call you Dad? The car was entirely quiet except for the sound of the road. Adeline's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. Not in alarm, he thought, more like someone bracing for something they had known was coming and still found themselves unprepared for when it arrived. Cole looked at Sophie. She was watching him with the steady directness that was, he had come to understand, one of the most specific things she had inherited from him. Not uncertain, not performing anything, just asking a clear question and waiting for a clear answer. He thought about what the word meant, not the legal meaning, which was already settled, not the technical meaning, which had always been true. The actual meaning, the daily weight of it, the responsibility it named, the relationship it described that had been building piece by piece across months of Tuesdays and Saturday afternoons and dinners and drum updates and school parking lots and the corner of the shop office where she drew mechanical diagrams from library books. "Yeah," he said, "you can." Sophie nodded once, the firm, decisive nod he knew well by now. "Okay," she said, and looked back out the window, apparently satisfied, done with the conversation the way she was done with conversations once they had delivered their required information. Adeline exhaled very slowly and said nothing and kept driving. Cole turned forward and looked at the road ahead and felt the specific and unmistakable weight of something that had been uncertain for a long time finally settling into place. Not lightly. Nothing real settles lightly. But it settled. The gathering in June was not planned as a celebration. It was just what happened when the people in Cole's life and the people in Adeline's life ended up in the same location for the same reason, which was Sophie's end-of-year school event, a thing the school called a showcase, where kids presented projects they'd worked on all semester to their families. Sophie had built a working model of a simple mechanical system that demonstrated gear ratio principles, using materials she'd sourced partly from Cole's shop, and she presented it with the thorough precision of someone who had rehearsed not the performance but the content, because she wanted people to actually understand it rather than simply applaud. Cole's neighbor Janet came because Mia was in the audience with Cole, and Janet had never missed anything involving Mia. George came because Sophie had asked him, with the directness with which she asked for everything, and George had said yes because he was constitutionally unable to say no to anyone who asked him a direct question. Adeline's CFO came with his wife because he had been part of Adeline's life long enough that Sophie knew him and had invited him, and he arrived with the slightly shell-shocked expression of a man who had not expected to spend a Tuesday evening at an elementary school showcase and was glad to be there. They sat in 2 rows because the seating arrangement required it, and the arrangement was Cole and Mia in the front, Adeline beside Cole, Janet beside Adeline, George and the CFO and his wife in the row behind. It was an accidental formation that looked from a distance like what it actually was, a collection of people who had come from different directions and ended up, through the unlikely navigation of specific circumstances, in the same place. Sophie presented her gear model to the gym full of families with the total composure of someone who has decided that confidence is not about how you feel before you speak, but about whether you know what you're saying. She explained the mechanical principles clearly. She answered 3 questions from the audience, 2 from other kids, and 1 from a parent who was an actual engineer and seemed genuinely impressed. She looked at Cole twice during the presentation. Not for reassurance, he understood, but the way you look at someone you want to know is watching. He was watching. He was always watching. Afterward, in the school gym with the folding table reception and the paper cups of lemonade, Mia found Sophie and the 2 of them immediately went to examine another kid's project with the collaborative intensity they applied to everything, their heads bent together, Mia's dark curls next to Sophie's tighter braids, and Cole stood with a paper cup of terrible lemonade and looked at them across the gym. Adeline came to stand beside him. She had a cup of the same lemonade and appeared to have made peace with it. "She looked at you," Adeline said. "I know." "She practices not needing people to watch," Adeline said. "She's been doing it since she was small. She decided early that needing people to notice was a vulnerability." A pause. "She looked at you anyway." Cole didn't say anything for a moment. He watched Sophie explain something to Mia using hand gestures that Mia followed intently. "She's going to be fine," he said. "I know," Adeline said. "She said it the way you say things you have needed to believe for a long time, and have finally found sufficient evidence to say with confidence. I know she is." They stood side by side in the gymnasium of an elementary school with paper cups of bad lemonade watching their daughters, and it was not a glamorous moment, and it was not a moment anyone would have made a movie about. And it was, without question, the most important kind of moment. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that just arrives and stays, that you carry forward without ceremony into everything that comes after. Janet appeared at Cole's elbow and said quietly, She did real well up there. Cole said she did. Janet patted his arm and went to find the cookies. George materialized on Adeline's side and said, with the brevity of a man who has learned to say the thing and stop talking, "Good kid." Adeline said thank you. George nodded and returned to the cookie table, which appeared to be the true draw for everyone over 50. Cole thought about what it takes to build a family. Not the idealized version, the version where everything resolves cleanly and people transform into their best selves, and love arrives as a warm light from a clear source. The actual version, which is built from imperfect people making imperfect decisions and living with the consequences and trying again, which is built from anger that doesn't fully go away, and grief that becomes manageable over time, and the slow accumulation of ordinary days that mean more than they appear to mean while you're living them. He thought about the years he'd missed and the years ahead of him. He thought about Sophie calling him dad in a car on the way home from a cardiology appointment, with the same matter-of-fact directness she applied to everything she decided was true. He thought about Mia saying "I like her" from the couch, while a cardboard city was being debated on his living room floor. He thought about Adeline at a kitchen table in February saying, "Let's build something," with the measured resolution of someone who had decided to stop being afraid of the things she wanted. He thought about a phoenix tattoo and what it had originally meant and what it meant now. The symbol of something burning down so that something else can begin from the same material. He had not thought about it that way in years, had stopped seeing it, the way you stop seeing the things that have been on your skin long enough to become part of the map of you. Sophie had made him see it again. She had seen it across a crowded garden with the recognition of someone who didn't yet know what she was recognizing and reached for it anyway, because something in her understood it before she had the words. That was the thing about children. They know things their knowledge hasn't caught up to yet. They act on the true version of the world before the adults have finished constructing their careful, protected version of it. Sophie had run across that garden because something in her recognized something that was already hers. She had been right, and she had not had the benefit of context or history or adult reasoning to tell her so. She had just known. There is something to be learned from that. There is something in the willingness to reach for what is already yours, even when you don't have all the information, even when the adults around you are still in the middle of managing the situation, even when running across a garden toward a stranger makes no particular logical sense. There is something in the refusal to wait until everything is certain before acting on what you know to be true. Cole had spent years making things smaller so they couldn't break. He had built walls not out of cowardice, but out of the exhaustion of someone who had lost things and didn't know how to survive losing more. He understood that about himself clearly now, the way you understand things about yourself, when enough time has passed and enough has changed to give you perspective on who you were. He didn't judge it. He had been doing what he could with what he had. But Sophie had run across a garden and grabbed his hand, and the box he'd built around his life had opened up. And what was inside it turned out to be larger than the box had ever been. He had a daughter who presented gear models to gymnasium audiences with the confidence of someone who knows her material. He had a daughter who made architectural welcome signs with missing letters and found this entirely defensible. He had the woman who had stood at the edge of his life for a decade, finally standing inside it, building something with him the way they were building everything, imperfectly, honestly, one day at a time, with the materials available, starting from what still worked. He had a life that was larger than the one he'd been living, which was the thing that happens when you stop building walls and start building instead toward something. Adeline looked up at him. "What are you thinking?" she said. "That I'm glad she ran," Cole said. Adeline followed his gaze to Sophie, who had apparently convinced Mia that the other project they were examining had an engineering flaw and was explaining this to the kid who'd built it, who was listening with the face of someone receiving information they weren't sure they wanted. "She's always been like that," Adeline said. "Since the beginning. She just goes directly at things." "She gets it from both of us," Cole said. Adeline looked at him. "Yes," she said. "She does." Sophie looked up from across the gymnasium, located them with the efficiency of someone who always knows where the people she belongs to are standing, and held Cole's gaze for a moment with an expression that was simply satisfied. The expression of someone who looked at their life and found it arranged correctly. Then she turned back to the engineering flaw she was explaining, because there was work to do, and she was the person to do it. Cole finished his terrible lemonade and set the cup down and thought that this, all of this, The gymnasium, and the paper cups, and the two daughters, and the woman beside him, and the months of building, and the anger that had softened into something bearable, and the grief that had become the foundation of something real. This was what the tattoo had always been pointing toward, even when he hadn't known it. Not the past it represented, the future it made possible. The phoenix doesn't burn down for nothing. It burns down so that what comes after has room to begin.